She lived alone and thought her yard was the most peaceful place. But one day the ground began to sink. Every day, the hole grew bigger, and what was found under the house turned her life upside down. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Margaret Hill's days had fallen into a steady rhythm, the kind of rhythm that grows around a person who has outlived her husband and grown accustomed to the quiet of a house that once held two voices instead of one. She was 70 now, her hair silver and thinning, her body slowed by the small aches of age. But her habits had not changed. Each morning she rose before the sun had fully brightened the Kentucky sky, brewed herself a modest pot of coffee, and carried her cup onto the back porch where she watched the birds descend onto the feeder she filled religiously. The yard was her sanctuary, a patch of green fenced in by hedges and marked by the flower beds she had tended with almost religious devotion since her husband Harold's passing a decade earlier. It was there, in the far corner of the yard near the old oak, that she noticed it first. At a glance, it was nothing more than a small depression in the soil, no larger than the heel of her shoe. She crouched carefully, her knees protesting, and touched the dirt with her fingers. It was soft, slightly loose, as though something underneath had shifted. She dismissed it at first, telling herself it was the work of moles or the slow settling of ground after the spring rains. It was not uncommon in Kentucky for the soil to play tricks. The land was known for sinkholes and caves, for the sudden swallowing of fields and roads. Still, she made a mental note of it, an imprint of unease that followed her back into the house. Over the next week, she found her eyes drawn to the same spot each morning. What had been a small dent seemed to widen little by little, the grass around it paling from bright green to a tired yellow. The marigolds she had planted nearby wilted unnaturally fast, their roots disturbed by some shift beneath them. Each step she took closer to the hole seemed to echo, as though the ground itself was hollow. She told herself it was imagination, that the loss of Harold had left her clinging to strange signs, but the hollow sound remained. At night, when she let the cat out onto the porch, she thought she could hear faint creaks and groans from the earth, subtle noises that carried the same tone as floorboards stretching in an old house. The neighbors eventually noticed as well. Mrs. Parker from 2 houses down peered over the fence one afternoon and remarked on the way the soil was sagging. She told Margaret about the limestone under their county, how caves riddled the earth and swallowed barns in the middle of pastures. A younger man walking his dog past her yard suggested she call a contractor who specialized in drainage. Another said she ought to ring the local university's geology department. Margaret smiled politely, nodded, and thanked them, but she did not reach for the phone. Something within her resisted. It was not simple stubbornness or pride, but a gnawing feeling that the answer to the widening depression was tied to Harold. She had lived with him nearly 50 years, through stretches of good and long years of quiet distance. And though he was gone, there were pieces of him she had never understood. Harold Hill had been known around Louisville's outskirts as a reliable contractor. He built sheds, reinforced barns, laid foundations for suburban homes that had sprouted during the last housing boom. People called him steady-handed, though few called him warm. He was a man who worked long hours, came home with his shirt smelling of dust and earth, and spent evenings tinkering in his basement workshop. Margaret had respected him more than she had loved him, though love had once been there. Over the years, she noticed his absences grew longer, and his explanations, jobs that needed travel, customers who needed discretion, were delivered with a tone that brooked no argument. He was not cruel, not overtly, but there was a distance to him that she learned not to bridge. Even so, she had trusted him. She had lived in this house, walked its hallways, cooked in its kitchen, without ever questioning what lay beneath. Yet as she stared at the hole spreading day by day, she thought of Harold's long nights in the basement, the way he locked the door when he worked, the tools she never saw, though she knew he purchased them. Memories slipped through like cracks in plaster, things she had ignored because marriage, in the end, often demanded silence more than confrontation. One afternoon, after a thunderstorm drenched the neighborhood and left rivulets running down the sidewalks, Margaret stepped onto her porch and felt her breath seize. The ground had collapsed further, no longer a hole but a jagged opening several feet across. Mud had slipped down the edges, and she could see blackness beneath, a darkness deeper than any animal's burrow. The oak tree's roots protruded into the void, raw and exposed like nerves. She stood frozen, coffee mug trembling in her hand, a thought pressing hard against her mind. Something was down there, something that had been hidden for years beneath the neat order of her yard. The sound of distant traffic hummed beyond the hedges, and somewhere a neighbor's child called for a dog. But in that moment she felt entirely alone. The yard that had been her sanctuary was now a wound, a rupture in the life she thought she knew. She tried to reason that it was only geology, a natural collapse, but the certainty did not hold. Kentucky soil might give way, but what she saw was not merely earth. It looked shaped, deliberate, as if the land had been hollowed for a purpose. That night she could not sleep. She sat by the window, the hole visible in the faint glow of the porch light, and let memories of Harold wash over her. His brusque manner, his sudden disappearances, the sharp look he gave when she once asked about his workroom. He had been a man of secrets, and she had lived beside those secrets without knowing their weight. The thought terrified her now. She had loved him once, trusted him enough to build a life, and yet what if beneath her feet lay proof that the man she shared a bed with was not who she thought he was? By morning the sun rose pale and weak, the yard still soggy from the storm. Margaret walked toward the hole, her shoes sinking slightly in the wet grass. She stood at its edge and peered down, heart pounding. The darkness below seemed to stare back, wide and bottomless. She felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. The hollow space beneath was no longer something she could dismiss or cover with soil. It was a demand, an opening into a truth she had spent her life avoiding. Her hands trembled as she backed away. The hole was no longer just a blemish in the yard. It was a summons. Something in her bones told her she would have to climb down into that darkness, and whatever she found there would shatter the fragile balance of her quiet days. The sanctuary of her yard was gone. In its place was a question that could not be ignored. She turned back toward the house, feeling older than her 70 years, and closed the porch door behind her. The hollow waited, patient and black, a silent witness to secrets buried in earth and time. It was only a matter of days before curiosity, fear, and inevitability drove her into its depths. The hole in Margaret's yard became the center of her thoughts from that storm onward. She tried to go about her morning routine as she always had, sipping coffee on the porch, scattering birdseed along the fence, trimming the edges of her flower beds. Yet her eyes were constantly drawn to that corner, where the earth had torn itself open. She could not look at the marigolds or the oak tree without feeling the weight of that darkness pressing back at her. It seemed to breathe, to widen imperceptibly each day, like a wound refusing to heal. She tried to imagine it was no more than geology, a sinkhole formed by water erosion, but the shape of it told another story. The edges did not crumble randomly, and the soil within appeared supported by something beneath. It was not nature's careless hand that had carved the cavity. It was something human. One morning she found herself standing at the lip of the opening, clutching a flashlight she had taken from the kitchen drawer. She had lain awake half the night, unable to resist the thought that she could not ignore this much longer. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of wood in the frame. Outside, the yard carried the faint, damp scent of last night's drizzle. She lowered herself onto her knees, placed the flashlight beam downward, and watched it cut through the black. What met her eyes sent a cold wave through her chest. There was structure down there. The light reflected against something man-made timber beams, metal scraps, the edge of a wall. She pulled the flashlight back with trembling hands, forcing herself to breathe evenly. A part of her screamed to call the county, to let officials assess what the earth had revealed. But another part, deeper and more insistent, told her that if she allowed strangers to investigate, she would lose control of whatever truth lay beneath. The secrets of her husband, perhaps her last connection to him, might be interpreted in ways that would strip her of the fragile dignity she had left. The decision formed in her mind was slow inevitability. She would go down herself. She gathered what she thought she might need: an old pair of work gloves, the sturdy shoes Harold had once worn in the yard, and a length of rope she found coiled in the garage. Her body protested the effort, her back stiff and her knees aching, but she moved with the determination of someone who knew that the only way forward was through confrontation. She tied the rope to the base of the oak tree and lowered it carefully into the dark. Her descent was clumsy, her arms weak, her grip uncertain, but she managed to guide herself down, boots sliding against the damp soil until they landed on solid ground. She steadied herself against a wall, breathing in air that smelled of mildew and rust. When she lifted the flashlight again, the beam revealed what her imagination had only feared. It was a room, hidden away all these years beneath the yard she had cherished. The walls were roughly bricked, patches of mortar crumbling, but reinforced in places with wooden planks and sheets of rusting metal. The space stretched farther than she expected, not a small cavity, but a chamber that someone had carefully constructed. Along one wall, a crude workbench sagged under the weight of tools. Hammers, saws, chains, blades dulled with age. On the opposite side, iron rings were bolted into the masonry, each attached to a length of chain that trailed onto the floor. She followed the line of her flashlight and froze at the sight of stains, dark patches seared into the concrete beneath. They were old, long dried, but the shape spoke wordlessly of suffering. Her throat tightened, and she leaned against the wall for balance. She wanted to deny what her senses told her, but denial dissolved in the face of what lay scattered across the ground. A woman's shoe, cracked with age. A child's small bracelet, its plastic beads dulled and broken. A purse slumped in the corner, its contents spilled long ago, papers yellowed and brittle. She moved slowly, each step a burden, as though she were trespassing in a graveyard. Margaret knew then what she had never dared to suspect. Harold, her husband of decades, the man buried with the honors of a hard-working citizen, had not simply been distant or strange. He had been a predator. The room she stood in was not an accident of nature, but his creation, his hidden world of cruelty and death. All those nights when he had locked himself in his workshop, all those unexplained absences, they converged into this single truth. She had lived with a man who had destroyed others, and she had never seen it. Her flashlight beam wavered as her hands shook. Memories flooded her, the stern silences at dinner, the late-night returns when his boots tracked mud through the hallway, the smell of iron that clung to his clothes at times. She remembered the way he deflected questions, the anger in his eyes when she pressed too far. At the time, she thought it was simply the temper of a man worn down by work. Now she understood it had been the fury of someone guarding a secret too monstrous to reveal. She turned, desperate to leave, desperate to breathe air that was not poisoned by the ghosts in that place. Her boots slipped on the damp floor, and she caught herself against the wall, leaving a smudge on the brick. She climbed the rope with trembling arms, each movement agonizing, until at last she pulled herself back into the daylight. She collapsed onto the grass, staring at the sky, her chest heaving with sobs that she had not felt since the night Harold's heart had stopped in their bedroom. Only this grief was worse. His death had taken his presence from her life, but this revelation destroyed the memory of who he had been. The hours passed in a haze. She moved through her house like a sleepwalker, her thoughts circling back to what she had seen below. At last, as the evening settled and the neighborhood lights flickered on one by one, she knew she could not carry this alone. She picked up the phone and dialed the sheriff's office, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. She told them there was something they needed to see. When the deputies arrived, their boots heavy on her porch, she guided them to the backyard. They lowered their lights into the opening, voices muttering in tones of disbelief. More vehicles came, sirens briefly cutting through the quiet night, and soon her yard was flooded with beams and footsteps. Neighbors gathered behind fences, eyes wide, whispers spreading like wildfire. Margaret stood apart, her hands clasped tightly, as though bracing herself against the collapse of her world. The investigators descended into the basement she had uncovered. They marked evidence, photographed the walls, collected the objects that bore silent testimony to what had happened there. One of them emerged holding the purse, another carrying the bracelet. Their faces carried no surprise, only grim confirmation of what such discoveries always meant. Margaret's heart sank as she realized how this would appear. Her property, her yard, her fingerprints now smudged across the walls. By midnight, the sheriff himself approached her. The yard was taped off, the ground lit with portable lamps, the crowd of neighbors still murmuring beyond the hedges. His expression was fixed, professional, but his eyes carried a judgment that made her stomach twist. Words were spoken about evidence, about responsibility, about custody. She felt the cold touch of handcuffs around her wrists before she fully registered what was happening. The night air burned against her skin as the deputies guided her to the waiting car. As the door closed and the engine started, she caught sight of the neighbors' faces, pale and astonished, some horrified, others almost eager in their shock. They saw not a widow who had spent 10 years in solitude, but a woman whose yard had opened to reveal a chamber of horror. To them it was simple. Margaret Hill had been hiding something unspeakable, and the police had found it at last. The patrol car pulled away, the flashing lights casting lurid color across the houses she had known for half a century. She pressed her forehead against the glass and closed her eyes. The images of chains and stains still carved into her mind. The house shrank behind her, its windows dark, its yard scarred, and she knew she would not see it again for a long time. The sanctuary of her life had become a crime scene, and she, in the eyes of everyone around her, had become its central suspect. The cell was colder than Margaret had expected, and its fluorescent light never dimmed enough to let her body forget it was trapped. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the odor of damp concrete. She had never set foot in a jail before, and now the narrow cot beneath her was the only piece of furniture in a space that felt more like a cage than a room. Each sound echoed, the slam of distant doors, the shuffle of guards' boots, the metallic click of keys turning. Her hands, swollen with age, still carried the faint impression of the handcuffs that had clasped them in her yard only hours earlier. She sat on the cot, staring at the gray floor, trying to steady her breath, but her chest heaved against the weight of disbelief. By morning, she was no longer simply a widow. She was a headline. The local newspaper carried the story on the front page. Widow arrested in cold case killings. The television channels ran footage of deputies escorting her into the county station, her thin frame dwarfed by their uniforms, her face pale and shocked. To the neighbors, she had been Margaret, the quiet woman who gardened and baked pies for the church. Now, in the eyes of the county, she was something else entirely. The story was irresistible to journalists. An old woman living alone, a hidden basement filled with chains and belongings of missing people, a mystery wrapped in decades of silence. Inside her cell, Margaret struggled with exhaustion and despair. She replayed the descent into the basement in her mind. The tools, the chains, the stains, and the unmistakable evidence of what had taken place there. She had been the one to find it, the one to call the authorities. Yet those very steps had bound her to the crimes in the eyes of the law. Her fingerprints were now on the walls, her voice the one that had summoned the sheriff. It did not matter that Harold had built and used that place. To the investigators, the basement existed on her property, beneath her yard, in her life. The sheriff's men treated her with a mixture of detachment and quiet suspicion. They spoke to her in clipped tones, their questions circling the same theme. What had she known, and for how long? She told them again and again that she had never seen the basement until the earth gave way, that her husband had kept secrets she had not dared to explore, that she had been blind to the man he really was. But the deputies exchanged glances that suggested disbelief. To them, it was easier to accept that the frail old woman had spent decades concealing horrors than to unravel the truth about a man who was safely buried and beyond questioning. In the weeks that followed, the case grew into a spectacle. Reporters camped outside the county courthouse, their vans parked in lines, their microphones angled toward any official willing to speak. They showed pictures of the objects recovered from beneath Margaret's yard: jewelry, purses, shoes, and chains. They reminded viewers of the families who had searched for missing loved ones in the 70s and 80s. For the audience at home, the narrative was simple and satisfying. The villain had been found, and she was a 70-year-old widow who had hidden behind the mask of an ordinary life. Margaret's health began to decline in the confines of the jail. The stress brought on spells of dizziness, and twice she was carried to the infirmary after her chest tightened in ways that felt like claws pressing against her ribs. She lay on the thin cot at night, the lights never fully extinguished, and stared at the ceiling until her eyes burned. The loneliness was unbearable. Friends from the church no longer visited. Her niece, who lived 2 towns over, stopped answering the phone. Even letters went unanswered, as though her arrest had severed her from everyone she had ever known. Through the noise of accusation, one figure stood apart. Detective Andrew Carter was young, new to the department, still carrying the earnestness that older colleagues had long since shed. He had read the case file and walked through the basement beneath Margaret's yard, but something about the official story unsettled him. He could not reconcile the frail widow with the narrative of a predator who had dragged victims into a hidden chamber. Her body showed none of the strength such crimes required. Her life none of the cunning such concealment demanded. To him, the scene bore the marks of someone else's design, someone with experience and ruthless intent. Andrew began to ask questions his superiors had little interest in hearing. He dug through old police reports of missing persons in Jefferson County, tracing timelines that stretched back decades. He compared them to records of Harold Hill's contracting work, his projects across the state, the periods when he claimed to be on job sites far from home. What he found unsettled him further. Harold's absences often coincided with the dates people had last been seen alive. He cross-referenced purchase receipts from hardware stores, discovering that Harold had bought large quantities of lumber, brick, and tools in years when he had no legitimate building projects underway. The young detective walked the basement again, this time studying not just the objects inside but the construction itself. He ran his hand over the brickwork, noting the way the mortar was set, the precision of the reinforcements. This was not the work of an amateur or a desperate woman. It was the calculated construction of a man trained in building, a man who understood how to carve a hidden space that could endure decades without collapse. Every corner whispered of Harold's profession. Every seam spoke of his hand. Margaret, however, remained in custody as he pursued these leads. The county prosecutor had already framed the case to the public. To them, it was tidy. The husband was dead. The wife remained alive. Blame her. Close the files. Give closure to the families. It was convenient, and it was final. But Andrew's persistence would not let him rest. He spent nights poring over ledgers and blueprints, the details of old construction contracts that bore Harold's signature. He interviewed older residents who remembered Harold's temper and the way he sometimes vanished for weeks under the guise of work. The more Andrew learned, the clearer it became that Margaret had been more prisoner than accomplice, living in ignorance above a chamber of horrors her husband had crafted. Margaret learned of none of this while she sat in her cell, shivering against the thin blanket, waiting for the next hearing. She only knew that the world outside saw her as guilty, that her neighbors whispered her name as though it were poison, that her life of quiet gardening and bird feeding had been erased by the discovery of that hidden room. Yet the truth had begun to take shape in the hands of the young detective. And though she did not yet know it, the first cracks in the case against her had already formed. As the days stretched into weeks, Andrew prepared his findings, each new piece of evidence building a case not against the widow, but against the memory of her husband. He knew it would be an uphill battle to challenge the narrative already cemented in the public mind. But he also knew that justice, if it meant anything at all, demanded that he try. The season outside shifted from the heavy rains of spring into the thick warmth of summer. The grass in the yards of Margaret's neighborhood grew tall in her absence, the hedges untrimmed, the flower beds untended. Children who rode their bikes past her house pointed to the caution tape still fluttering in the wind, their voices hushed with the thrill of fear. Inside her cell, Margaret clung to the memory of the life she had once known, unaware that somewhere in the stacks of old receipts and the lines of crumbling mortar, a stranger was fighting to return her freedom. The world still saw her as the villain, but beneath the surface a different story had begun to stir. The truth was slower than accusation, more fragile than rumor, but it was moving, piece by piece, toward the light. And though Margaret could not yet see it, the foundation of her condemnation was starting to weaken, the weight of her husband's secrets shifting at last onto the shoulders where they truly belonged. When the county prosecutor finally stood before the cameras to announce that the charges against Margaret Hill were being dropped, the statement was delivered with none of the fire that had accompanied her arrest. There were no dramatic headlines this time, No live footage of deputies escorting her in shackles. No breathless reporters calling her a monster. Instead, the announcement was couched in technical language, the kind that made it sound like the matter had been no more than a clerical misunderstanding. Evidence, they said, had been reevaluated. Timelines had been clarified. The suspect, once deemed responsible for a string of disappearances, was no longer facing trial. It was treated as a footnote in the evening news cycle, squeezed between weather forecasts and coverage of a local fair. For Margaret, the release from custody was not a triumph. It was more like stepping out of one prison and into another. The cell that had contained her for weeks was gone, but in its place stood an entire county of eyes that no longer saw her as a neighbor or a woman who tended flowers and baked pies. They saw the widow of Harold Hill, the woman whose backyard had cracked open to reveal chains and stains and bones of the past. They saw the old woman whose name had been printed above stories of murder. No matter what the prosecutors now said, the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. She returned to her house under the gaze of news cameras that trailed her car until it turned into her street. Neighbors stood behind their curtains, some too curious to hide, watching as she unlocked her door with trembling hands. The house smelled of dust and emptiness. The grass outside had grown long, the hedges wild, the flower beds invaded by weeds. And in the far corner of the yard, sealed now with concrete by county crews, was the scar that had consumed her life. Yellow caution tape still clung to the oak tree, fluttering in the summer wind, a reminder that no amount of cement could bury what had been found beneath. Margaret tried to resume her old habits, but nothing felt the same. When she stepped onto the porch with her coffee, the feeder stood empty because the birds no longer came. Perhaps it was only coincidence. Perhaps the commotion of investigators and flashing lights had driven them away, but to her it felt like a judgment. When she walked to the grocery store, people moved aside in the aisles. Some whispered. A few stared openly. The cashier avoided her eyes. Even in church, where she had spent decades filling the pews and singing hymns, she felt the congregation lean away. An entire pew lay empty on either side of her, the silence more cutting than words. Her name had been cleared in court documents, but not in the hearts of those around her. To them, innocence was not proof. Innocence was only a technicality. Children on bicycles who once waved as they rode past her yard now sped faster, pointing at her house and daring each other to pedal close to the porch. Someone spray-painted a single word on her mailbox one night, which before it was hastily scrubbed away by city workers. The word lingered in her mind long after the paint was gone. Detective Andrew Carter, the one man who had believed in her innocence when no one else would, visited her from time to time. He came in plain clothes, not the uniform that would have drawn more eyes. He sat with her in the living room, sipping coffee she made too strong, and tried to assure her that justice had been served, that the truth was what mattered. But Margaret knew better. She could see in his eyes the weight he carried too, the knowledge that he had fought not only against the evidence, but against a system eager for closure. She appreciated his presence, yet she understood that his belief could not erase the mark left upon her by the wider world. The house itself had changed. The basement door, once locked by Harold, now stood ajar with its secret stripped away. The county had sealed the hidden chamber, but Margaret could still feel it beneath her feet, like a second heartbeat thudding under the floor. She wandered the rooms in the evenings, touching the furniture, the picture frames, the worn edges of curtains, and wondered how many nights she had lived above that darkness without knowing. Her life had been built on soil that concealed horror, and now that horror had surfaced, nothing familiar could feel innocent again. Offers to purchase the property never came. The house had become infamous, a landmark of whispered stories. No family wanted to raise children where investigators had carried out boxes of evidence. Realtors did not bother listing it. Margaret realized that she would live out her days in the place that had betrayed her, bound to it not by choice but by circumstance. She tried to keep the yard tidy, trimming what she could, planting flowers where the grass refused to grow, but she felt the weight of eyes from neighboring windows, judging each movement as though she were still under surveillance. Nights were the worst. Alone in her bed, she listened to the groans of the house, the settling of wood and stone, and imagined footsteps in the hidden basement that no longer existed. She thought of Harold, of the man she had once believed to be only distant and stern, and felt her stomach knot. How had she lived beside him all those years without seeing? How had she shared meals, shared a bed, shared a name with someone who had built a chamber of cruelty in their own yard? The shame was not hers, and yet it clung to her skin as though it were. Sometimes Andrew would stop by after work, bringing files he no longer needed, showing her the receipts and signatures he had uncovered that had finally persuaded the prosecutors. He spoke of how Harold's travel records matched the disappearances, how his purchases of lumber and metal lined up with the construction of the hidden basement. He laid it all out clearly, the proof that her husband had been the true monster, not her. Margaret would listen quietly, nodding, and thank him. Yet she could not bring herself to feel relief. Truth on paper did not mend the way people looked at her when she stepped outside. As summer deepened into autumn, Margaret grew accustomed to her new reality. She was free, yet not free. She was innocent, yet never again innocent in the eyes of those around her. Each day she woke in a house that bore the stain of her husband's sins and went to bed with the knowledge that nothing could undo the whispers. Her life had been rewritten by a hole in the earth, a hole that had revealed not only the hidden crimes of the dead, but the cruelty of the living in their hunger for blame. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the yard in the shades of gold, she sat on the porch with a photograph in her lap. It was of herself and Harold in their youth, taken at a county fair. He stood tall beside her, his arms stiffly placed around her shoulders, both of them smiling for the camera. She traced the edges of the photograph with trembling fingers, studying the face she had once loved, and felt a hollow ache in her chest. The world believed she had shared in his darkness, and in some way perhaps she had, if only by closing her eyes to the parts of him she did not understand. The street was quiet. The neighbors' children were called inside for supper. The leaves rustled faintly in the breeze. Margaret closed her eyes and listened, trying to imagine a time before the hole, before the chains and the headlines, before suspicion had devoured her name. When she opened them again, the photograph still lay across her knees, and the scar in her yard was visible just beyond the hedges. She realized then that truth could be uncovered, but innocence, once lost, could never be restored. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the shadows stretched across her porch. Margaret sat alone in the twilight, the weight of silence pressing around her, knowing that the truth had saved her from prison, but not from judgment. The official record might clear her, but in the eyes of the town she would always be the woman above the basement, the widow of Harold Hill, the name spoken in whispers long after she was gone. And as the darkness settled in, she accepted that this was the price of truth. Freedom without peace, exoneration without redemption, a life forever marked by secrets she had never chosen to keep. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Make sure to check out our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.